Welcome to our voter forum for ballot measure 90. The forum will last approximately 40 minutes and will cover ballot measure 90, creating a top 2 primary system in Oregon. I'm your moderator, Debbie Kaye, with the League of Women Voters of Portland. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that works to help citizens make informed choices in elections. We do not endorse candidates or political parties, but rather we give voters the information that you need to be informed voters. Membership information is available on our website and at the table at the back of the room. We thank the Multnomah Bar Foundation, Neil Kelly Design, and Paloma Clothing for their generous contributions to our education fund, making these forums possible. Today's forum is being recorded by our media partner, Portland Community Media. All forums will be available for on-demand viewing from a link on our website, lwvpdx.org. To view the forums on local access cable TV, see the playback schedule on the table at the back of the room and again posted on our website. Voters can also look at our nonpartisan Voter's Guide for answers to questions posed to all candidates, as well as a nonpartisan presentation of the ballot measures. The Voter's Guide is on our information table in print form and on our website, again, lwvpdx.org. You will find free copies at Multnomah County libraries, such as this one, and at the Multnomah County Elections Office. Another important voter resource is housed at the Secretary of State's website. It is called ORSTAR and enables you to see the financial sources for campaigns, essentially to follow the money. Type ORESTAR into your browser. And finally, to see information about the candidates and ballot measures that will appear on your ballot, go to this website, vote411.org. It's one of the coolest things. Enter your street address and the voter's guide information for only those items on your ballot will appear. Ballots will begin to be mailed today, so look for yours very soon. Now, on to the forum. To discuss Measure 90, we are joined today by Megan Moyer of the No on Measure 90 campaign and former Oregon Secretary of State Phil Kiesling of the Vote Yes on Measure 90 campaign. Our forum will consist of opening statements followed by different types of questions and then closing statements. For each round of questions, I will rotate the respondents so that the same speaker is not always the first to answer. Questions directed to one side will be given 2-minute responses with a 1-minute rebuttal for the opposing side. For questions that apply equally to both sides, respondents will have 75 seconds to present their answers. Members of the audience are invited to pose questions. Please write them legibly on the cards distributed for that purpose. Timekeepers sitting in the front row, thank you very much, will signal a 15-second warning and then stop when the speaker's time has expired. Let us begin. Before my questions, and beginning with Mr. Kiesling, each speaker will have 7 minutes for opening statements to explain your positions. Mr. Kiesling.
Thank you, and thank the League of Women Voters for putting on this very informative series of events. As Oregon Secretary of State from 1991 to 99, I had the distinct pleasure of working with the League of Women Voters on a reform that many poo-pooed at the time and was opposed by both the Democratic and Republican parties, as this one is. That was vote by mail. Now, vote by mail was a simpler law to pass. Literally all we did was remove the word not so that the statute read, all general and primary elections shall be conducted by mail. Measure 90 is longer, and it certainly has more complexity, though I'd argue that that has a lot to do with how poorly the legislature over the last century has written our election law. But what does it actually do, and what is at the heart of it? Something just as basic, just as simple, and just as graspable for voters as to what it does, which is it gives all Oregon voters the equal right in every election to choose from all of the candidates, and they can vote for whoever they want regardless of their own party registration or lack thereof, regardless of the candidate's party registration or lack thereof, and then the top two would advance from that first round to the November general election. No country, no matter how big or powerful, has a guaranteed right to have a finalist in the Olympic round of medals, do they? Well, this concept is pretty similar. No political party, and I want to remind people, political parties under Oregon law are private organizations. No political party or candidate would have that same guarantee either. Instead, they'd have to perform and earn their spot on the November ballot. This is a powerful and simple idea. Now, you will hear in the campaign about how complicated it is, confusing, the weeds of Oregon election law. People will even allege things about this law that just aren't true. But I want you to think, as you debate this and consider this, that one basic core principle to ensure that every voter is equal in every election. Now, how do we illustrate that? Well, picture yourself at a kitchen table. It's the May primary. You're a registered Democrat, let's say, and your spouse or partner is a registered Republican. I actually grew up in such a mixed marriage household myself. Perhaps you have a grown son and a grown daughter who are there at the table around as well. The son is a registered Libertarian, and your daughter is none of the above, a non-affiliated, as over 500,000 voters now are. And by the way, 50% of voters 18 to 30 are choosing something other than Democratic or Republican Party. 50%. And 30% total fall into that category. So what's happening around that table? You get your Republican ballot. Your spouse or partner gets a Democratic ballot. You can only vote within those parties. Your daughter, your son, maybe you can vote on some judge races that are usually unopposed. They can't vote for U.S. Senator, for governor, for Congress, for state legislator. They're locked out. 650,000 Oregonians locked out because of a closed primary system. Now, that's just the start. In another maybe 300, 400,000, voters in one of those major parties are so overwhelmed because the other party dominates that, yeah, they can vote, but the race is over. In fact, if you look at the 75 legislative races that are on the ballot this fall, probably 90% of them were over after the May election. This is the dirty little secret of elections. The campaign operatives know it, the special interest groups know it, and the political parties know it, which is why they don't like this. Because if all they have to do is get their candidates to win enough votes in these low turnout, small primary elections, it's over. Predominantly Democratic district here in Portland, the Democratic nominee will win. I know this. I ran in that kind of district and was elected to the legislature in 1988. And in rural parts of Oregon, Republican wins, you're basically golden. This Measure 90 would stop that. Every primary election, by definition, would be more competitive because every candidate runs, including minor party candidates. No one's guaranteed a slot in November. They got to earn it, remember. Always more competitive in May, and most of the time more competitive in November. But what if both candidates turn out to be Republicans? Well, in heavily Republican districts, that's not illogical. Washington, California, that has happened. But think about it. Not all Republicans are alike. Not all Democrats are alike. You would have meaningful competition in that case, and you don't now, most of the time. And in a weird, bizarre kind of case where things may split really strangely, like a 1-7-10 split in bowling, theoretically it can happen. I've had them. We preserve the write-in ability. Unlike California law, all the statutes about a write-in candidacy are still there. Ballots are required to have the blank space. Don't let the opposition pretend that that's not the case, because it is. We could talk more about it if you want. I also want to stress how familiar this system is if you stop and think about it. There's about 150 partisan races. Congress races, Senate, governor, the other 3 statewide, 90 legislative seats, some county commission races. There are literally over 5,000 elected officials in Oregon that we elect on a nonpartisan basis. That's a term of art in the statutes by which people run. They don't have party primaries. And yes, if they get 50% plus 1, they can win. They cannot, though, win in this system. And again, don't let people pretend it's otherwise. The law is very clear, as much as people want to suggest otherwise. You always advance the top two. That's a difference with the nonpartisan race. And another difference is you get to see the party registration of the candidate, so voters get that information. And if a party wants to endorse a candidate, that information too is on the ballot, provided the candidate wants to accept it. Again, this is a key thing. Voters want this information, and this makes our bill superior to the versions in Washington and California. So I want to just summarize. Every voter in every election, primary is the only one this is an exception, now we would change that. Every voter gets the same ballot. All the candidates appear. You can vote for whoever you want regardless, and the top two advance. This is a very important reform that we think will make Oregon elections fair and our government much more responsive to the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Moyer, you too have 7 minutes to present the opposing position.
I think the thing that is important to think about in Measure 90 is the difference between theoretical and reality. Measure 90 might seem really appealing theoretically, but we've seen it actually play out in 3 states that have top 2 elections, Louisiana, Washington, and California. And the reality is something far, far different from what the proponents are talking about. First, I don't believe that the proponents of Measure 90, potentially speaker accepted, particularly not the funders, are being motivated by increasing voter participation of unaffiliated voters. In fact, the chief petitioner, Jim Kelly, was quoted saying on Think Out Loud that this wasn't about election reform, it was about the kind of candidates it would produce. And the overwhelming majority of the money funding the Yes on 90 campaign is from out-of-state businesses and billionaires. John Arnold gave $1.5 million. He is a Texas billionaire who made his fortune as an Enron trader and then a hedge fund operator. He has no history of being engaged in electoral reform. He does have a history of wanting to push school reforms that privatize education and attacking public employee pensions. That is his history politically. So I ask myself, maybe I've become cynical, I'm not sure, why are Oregon Business Association and Associated Oregon Industries and John Arnold and Tim Boyle and all of these billionaires, why do they all of a sudden care about Oregon election? And it's not participation, it's because what top 2 primaries produce. They produce more business-friendly candidates who will push their narrow agenda. And I want to talk about why that is. Top 2 primaries disproportionately give power to primary voters. And primary voters are disproportionately whiter, older, more affluent, and more conservative. Top 2 systems have never produced greater voter participation. In fact, in California, in 2010, they had the 2nd lowest primary turnout in their history. In 2012, they had the lowest primary turnout that they've ever had. This does not once has it proven to increase participation of primary voters. But what it has done is it has made races more and more expensive. Here's an example. Right now in California, Congressman Mike Honda, who is in a Democratic seat, been in Congress for 8 terms, known as a human rights champion, somebody who had actually spent time in a Japanese internment camp, had in an open primary system, in a top 2, not open primary system, he was challenged by a fellow Democrat who was solely funded by Silicon Valley, who spent $3 million against him in that race, in the primary race. Together, the 2 of them spent $4 million in a primary, just to then face off again in the general election. Now, I think Mike Honda's probably going to win that race, but it really, really changes the dynamics of elections. When you enter into a system where parties are not getting to select their candidates, then you really enter the realm of candidate-centered elections. And I teach political science at Portland Community College. And we actually have a chapter on the candidate-centered election. And what is candidate-centered elections? Well, what happens is as people don't have ways to affiliate a candidate with an ideology, it becomes all about what is the persona that they put out there. What is the vibe I get? What's the TV ad? Well, I've been part of working on electoral campaigns for a long time, and I know how little is said in mail pieces or on TV ads and what of value voters really have to go off of. And what happens is when voters don't have those identifiers, they have to go off of the name that they recognize. If spending a lot of money in elections didn't work, then people wouldn't do it. But this system exacerbates that problem, making it virtually impossible for a grassroots candidate to make it to a general election. In fact, in Washington and California, there is not one example, not one race, where there were two candidates from a major party or a third party or non-affiliated candidate made it. And that's two candidates from one or two of the major parties. It could have been two Democrats or two Republicans. Minor parties are utterly shut out in top two. And that is why the Pacific Green Party opposes this, the Libertarian Party opposes this, the Constitution Party opposes this, and the Progressive Party opposes this. It's not just about competitiveness. There are right now 6 candidates for U.S. Senate that are going to be on the November ballot. There are 5 candidates that are going to run for governor. And you may not choose to vote for one that is not from a major party or minor party. Maybe you want to back somebody you think will win. But that's not always why people run. Some people run because they want to enter issues into the debate. They want to be present there. They want to hold maybe the major party candidates accountable. Issues like abolition came from third parties and minor parties like the Republican Party. Issues like marriage equality were championed early by minor parties before they ever entered the dialogue of major parties. And those candidates may not have ever had a chance to win, but that's not why they participate. And this idea that, oh, but they could endorse a major party candidate and that would be okay, really doesn't respect the role of minor parties. Minor parties have distinctly different views from major parties. They need to be represented and have the right to be represented to voters. And voters should have choice in the election that counts. When only less than 30% of Oregonians vote in primaries, and there's absolutely no evidence that that is going to change under top 2, should they be limiting our choice to just 2 when the vast majority of voters are voting? There are 6 different primary systems in the United States, but only the top 2 system limits choices in the November election when it matters most.
Thank you. We will open the question section of the discussion, allowing each representative to ask a question of the opposing side, and respondents will have 2 minutes to answer. Ms. Moyer, what question would you like to ask the Yes on 90 campaign?
I would like to ask the Yes campaign why your measure is so heavily supported by out-of-state billionaires.
I think you're asking a question to John Arnold, who I don't know and have never met. You know, one of the biggest supporters of the physician-assisted suicide measure that put Oregon on the map, tough issue, was a gentleman outside who was a billionaire, head of University of Phoenix. You know, the issue of who supports it, the chief petitioner is a Democrat. I'm a lifelong Democrat. The Working Families Party, which is advocating, I think, for a $15 an hour minimum wage, if memory serves me correctly, is fully supporting this. So are they being duped? I don't think so. You know, Oregonians are smart enough to vote on something on its merits. This happens to have attracted the attention of some people with a lot of money out of state. That's true. Just as there's a lot of billionaires putting money into races for Democratic Senate candidates around the country. Are we going to say that anybody who has a lot of money, if they support this, therefore we should vote no, or vice versa? I don't think so. I'll note that the opposition to this is some of the best funded political action committees in Oregon. I like organized labor generally. I had a 100% voting record when I was in the legislature for organized labor. But I don't think organized labor is always right. And I think on this one there's wrong. In fact, none of the groups in the coalition in organized labor that I'm aware of let their own members vote on this before they decided that it was a bad thing for Oregonians. The Independent Party of Oregon let its members vote on this, and they too decided that this was worth supporting. So I urge people to look not at who is supporting or even opposing in the money. We're going to have those debates until I'm long past from this earthly vale of tears. Look at what this measure does. It lets every voter in every election choose from the candidates they want, regardless, and lets the top two advance, a system that is used in the vast majority of elections, but improved in this way. The point about candidate-centered elections, remember, we have the information on the ballot of candidates' party registration and endorsement, which isn't true in the candidate-centered elections that I think that study refers to.
Thank you.
So
excuse me, your time is up.
Right, so I get to ask a question.
That is true.
Okay. So my question is this, and Megan, I do appreciate the role of minor parties. As Secretary of State, I actually fought to make the rules easier, to let them qualify and to stay qualified on the ballot. They do play an important role. But I want to ask you if you can come up with a single example in the last half century where a candidate on a minor party line in Oregon has gotten even 15% of the vote, much less won an actual election. And don't you think that experience over the last half century tells us that minor party candidates are far more often likely to play a spoiler role, turn the election to someone else, like Ralph Nader did with Al Gore in Florida, or what some people think Al Mobley, who was an independent candidate, did in directing an election away from Republican Dave Frohmeyer. So minor parties, you make a big point of that. Could you, yeah, that's my question.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to keep it super contemporary. I don't even need to go back in history. Right now, Kaiser, Oregon, there's an independent named Chuck Lee who has joined the race against Republican Bill Post, and I don't even remember the Democratic candidate, who I think has a very real chance of winning, but I guarantee will get over 15% of the vote. Right now, independent party, also endorsed by the Working Families Party. Chuck Lee, check it out if I'm right. We'll see, but I think he has a very real chance of winning, and he absolutely will get more than 15% of the vote. Second is, look at South Dakota right now. Incredibly fascinating U.S. Senate race. We've got 4 candidates in this race, and it is completely up in the air right now. We've got a Democrat, we've got a Republican, we've got a former Republican turned independent, and I think we have a Constitution Party, all of whom are actually pulling significant percentages of the vote. It has been a very, very interesting debate. In fact, the New York Times just did a great article 2 days ago about this race, and the thing that I really got from that article was the fact that because there were 4 candidates with distinctly different views talking about all sorts of issues that were really specific to South Dakota, you were having a debate and people were so much more engaged. And I point that out because a study out of USC looked at when the top 2 races end up being 2 candidates from the same party, voter participation drops by over 8%. And why is that? Because there's not real choice. When you have 2 candidates on a general election ballot who largely agree, what does that leave for the people who don't agree with those 2 candidates? And so, I see it right now in the 4th Congressional District in Washington with Didier and Newhouser. They're both anti-choice. They're both anti-Affordable Care Act. They're both anti-raising the minimum wage. And so, what is choice?
Thank you. We have several questions that the League has prepared, and each side has 75 seconds to respond, and we will change the order of respondents. Each of you has talked a little bit about minor parties, but I want to have a little more clarity here. Minor parties are divided on the effect of this issue. Beginning with you, Ms. Moyer, please explain from your perspective why the minor parties opposed to your position have taken that stance.
So there is a distinct difference between why the Independent Party and the Working Families Party would be supportive of Measure 90 and why the Libertarian, Constitution, Progressive, and Green parties are opposed. It is how they choose to endorse candidates. The Libertarian, Constitution, Progressive, and Green Party want to field their own candidates. They don't want to be a party of Me Too. They want people who have their values on the ballot creating debate. On the side of the Working Families Party and the Independent Party, and this is completely their choice, that they have decided to really adopt fusion voting, which is where they seek out major party candidates, and if those major party candidates they feel also share their values, they'll say, and us too. They're the Democratic candidate and they're the Working Families candidate, which might indicate what type of Democrat that was. Or it might not. It depends on if that candidate wants that endorsement or not. But they don't field their own distinct candidates with their own views. And I think that that's really important about why the minor parties that have their own candidates are so strongly opposed to this.
Thank you. Mr. Kiesling, what do you have to say?
I think it's telling that the question I asked was not answered. No candidate since 1974 has been elected to any of these offices in Oregon other than a Democrat or a Republican. And in 1974, it was a non-affiliated candidate. Minor parties play a valuable role, but unfortunately, many of them have an interest in having a place on the ballot and talking, but not being serious about winning. The Working Families Party and the Independent Party of Oregon, which Mr. Chuck Lee has been endorsed by, the only reason he probably has a chance in that one particular race is there's no Democrat running. Okay, it's a two-way race. This is a great illustration of the value of this system because he has a chance. He won't be a spoiler. Now, philosophically, the notion of having more choice is always good. But meaningful choice is what this is about. And the Working Families and Independent Parties of Oregon, I think you're going to see their own candidates running because they now can go out and get people to register with them without having people in danger of being shut out. That's the case now. And they have a chance to run candidates that can compete and earn that slot in the November election.
Thank you. Our next question, starting with Mr. Kiesling. In many districts in Oregon, the result of the measure will be two candidates from the same party running in the general election in November. Why is this good or bad for Oregon voters?
Well, for Oregon voters, they will have a chance to have a meaningful competition in that general election that does not exist today because it's over in these districts. People in this audience, and I think viewers watching this, they know how this works. The opponents of this want to pretend it doesn't work this way, but it does. You win the primary, you win the election in the vast majority of these legislative seats. Now, that's going to force candidates from the beginning to speak to every voter in the district, not just to a small vocal few, which, by the way, I think increases the polarization, the partisanship, and the gridlock that prevents us from dealing with major problems in this state, and that is a huge selling point of Measure 90. We've seen Congress and the gridlock there, that's so evident. But in the cases this happens, the experience in Washington, California says it's almost always in these cases that are lopsided to begin with. And I want to point out that in 11 of those Washington districts, there will be a candidate other than a Democrat or Republican on the November ballot as one of two. And yeah, they didn't result there because there was multi-candidates, but they have a chance to compete and win for the first time and not be a spoiler.
Thank you. I have a couple of audience.
Does Megan get to answer
Oh,
that
I'm
too?
so sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, I was just
That's okay.
very busy trying to choose my questions. Excuse me.
I think that it's really important to think about the question of competitiveness. One, is that actually our goal? Do we want more races to be competitive for the sake of competitiveness? If that were the goal here, then why didn't we take on redistricting? Because really, overwhelmingly, the evidence of why so few races are competitive has to do with how we draw our borders. But that's not what this talks about. And then the question of, is competitive really a goal that we should be aspiring to? Two identical twins who run for office, who share exactly the same values, would be a competitive race. But would it actually provide voters' choice? Is that the goal in and of itself? Competitive also means expensive. I think we need to be very honest about that. Now, I am for healthy democracy, and I am for people having real choices and it be a real debate and it not be so lopsided. But incumbency is a tremendous advantage. So I question the idea of, is this really going to result with that? An example is looking over the last 6 years of Oregon and Washington, they have had exactly the same percentage of races that have been within 10 points of each other. It does not create more competitive races, but it does limit choice.
Thank you. In more focused questions, beginning with you, Ms. Moyer, the measure allows the legislature to correct and improve upon the primary system if it were passed. Why doesn't this approach mitigate the criticisms of the initiative?
Well, maybe it's because I've worked through the legislative process and know enough to know that you can't guarantee that the legislature is going to fix the problems. And there are very real problems with this measure, and I think it's important to bring them out. One is, in Section 6, if you look at the measure, it implies that unless otherwise stated in the measure, these races shall be run like nonpartisan statewide races. Well, the only nonpartisan statewide race we have right now is labor commissioner. And the way the labor commissioner works is if you get 50% plus 1 in the primary, there is no general election, which means that we would run all of our races that if you got 50% plus 1, you win. There is no general election, and that's a pretty major flaw. Second is it seems to eliminate write-in candidates in the general election because it explicitly says that it is only the top 2 candidates that are eligible for the general election. The third is it allows county commissioners to replace legislative seats when they become vacant, regardless of the intent of the voter from that district. Well, I'm going to be honest, as somebody who's progressive, that makes me really uncomfortable because there are only 3 counties in Oregon where there is a majority Democrat in the county commission. But yet there are lots of Democrats who are elected statewide who most likely their county commission would replace them with a Republican. That could be a really big deal. I don't think the legislature is very quick to overturn what voters do. So the idea that the proponents have been claiming of, oh, the legislature will fix, don't worry about it, the legislature will fix that. I say, let's have clean things on the ballot and not assume the legislature is going to reinterpret voter intent.
Thank you. Mr. Kiesling.
In all of those instances just cited, there is nothing to fix because there's not a problem. These arguments are as phony as a $3 bill. The law says unless otherwise provided. In 3 separate cases, it otherwise provides that the top 2 vote getters advance to the general. There's no 50% unless they have less than 50%. That's just imaginary. It's made up. It's inserting words into statutory language that do not exist. Very disappointed that the opponents, in particular organizations who I've had a lot of respect for over the years, have tried to promote these falsehoods. It seems to eliminate the write-in? Not at all. The write-in statutes remain intact in this. In fact, the law still provides that lines are there. It says that the top 2 advance to the general election. But it doesn't change at all your ability as it is today to write in a candidate you like, and if they get the most votes, they get elected. So please, read the bill carefully. This is not the case.
Thank you. An audience question, and then we will do wrap-up. Do you think that in safe districts considered leaning towards a particular candidate or a particular party, the top 2 system will decrease the chances of victory by the most extreme candidate? I think you start, Mr. Kiesling.
In safe districts, Does it reduce the chances?
Does it decrease the chances of victory by the most extreme candidate? Or you could expand on that question.
Yeah, let me think. I think I know where the question is trying to get at. We know today that the vast majority of legislative districts get determined in the primary. So then who votes in the primary? Well, we get about 35%, 40% turnout of registered party members in a primary election. The median age, by the way, is 61. Now, that may not bother people in this room, but it bothers me because I think the people most affected by politics are going to be younger people. And if you think that that stays static forever, and I think that's cynical, okay? I think things do change over time because candidates are going to figure this out, and voters are going to figure it out, and people who have good causes and great things to talk about are going to figure it out, and they're going to mobilize and get people working in the primary. And they're going to start talking about more interesting issues, and they're not going to just cater to the extremes within both political parties. Look, the term getting primary didn't even exist 10 years ago. Candidates today go to the legislature and they're ready to take a tough vote to solve a key problem, and they pull their finger back from the green button, and you know why? They're afraid of getting primary by the far right in the Republican primary and in the far left in the Democratic. This will change that dynamic, and I think you'll get more thoughtful and brave candidates and maybe some better ideas. I think better ideas.
Well, let's look at the experience of states that have already done top two. Louisiana, the first state. They call it jungle primary there, but it's top two. Twice they've advanced David Duke to the general election, once for U.S. Senate and once for governor. David Duke, you may know, is a very noted white supremacist. Not particularly moderate in my mind. Second is, there's a study out of USC where they looked at what has top two produced candidate-wise as far as California's experience. Well, they found that, in fact, it made Republican candidates who advanced to the top two were slightly more ideologically extreme after top two. The one, and this is what I strongly believe the funders of the Yes on 90 campaign have also taken note of, so what the study found was that they were able to identify that for the Democratic candidates that advanced to a general election under top two did appear to be slightly more business friendly, was the result of top two systems. There's no evidence that it moderates candidates whatsoever. The reality is we've seen the opposite in some instances.
Thank you. As we are running out of time, I will invite you to have your concluding statements, beginning with Mr. Kiesling.
If you believe that Oregon is Louisiana or California, I don't. I think that we as Oregonians have a proud tradition of being first and being willing to try new things when we realize that what we're doing over and over and over again isn't addressing our problems and making our politics respond to what the majority of our people want. I think we're at that point and have been for some time. I think also this is part of a national movement, just as giving women the right to vote at the turn of the century, which, by the way, failed 3 times before it passed and was opposed by a lot of the most powerful institutional forces. I think what we've done with vote by mail and expanding the franchise, registration and opening that up, all of these have been proud reforms that have been based on simple ideas of the rights of voters. Is there any certainty about what happens in any election system, including the one we have now? No. And if you think it can never be better, if you think the current system really is a well thought out, put together thing, and yeah, okay, maybe 90% of the elections are over in the primary, but that's okay because we're afraid that in 1 or 2 of these instances, and you can cherry pick out of 150 California races over a single cycle, an example or 2 that you don't like. I can find ones where conservative Tea Party Republicans will be driven from office because of this that otherwise would have survived. That is not, though, how this ought to be looked at. This ought to be looked at as a matter of Oregon values. This ought to be looked at as whether all of us should be equal in every single election with the freedom to pick every candidate. And to say that, well, competitiveness is overrated. No, it's not. We need more competition between ideas, between candidates. We need to open the door to encourage more people to run. This Measure 90, based on this very simple idea, would continue the Oregon story of progress and enfranchisement and deserves your support.
Thank you. Ms. Moyer.
Measure 90 is an initiative that does not deal with the real problems with what we have in elections. Listen, I am not saying that we shouldn't have a very robust conversation about election reform. I am deeply concerned about the role of money in politics. I'm deeply concerned about enfranchising voters, particularly younger voters. But there is no evidence. In fact, there is evidence on the other side that Top 2 actually makes those issues worse. I am not saying Oregon does everything perfectly, and I do absolutely support a conversation. But out of the 6 different primary systems that this country uses, Top 2 is the only one that is limiting voters' choice in a general election. And I am yet to hear a compelling argument of why that's necessary. Why can't we have 3, 4, or 5 candidates in a general election? Why can't I get to vote my conscience? And if my conscience happens to be someone who is not competitive, so be it. I want to be able to do that. I don't view voting for somebody who's not going to win as throwing my vote away. I view it as my statement of values. And if that candidate happens to be an underfunded grassroots candidate who's not the darling of special interests, then I'm saying something by backing that candidate, and I don't dismiss them. Oh, well, they just would have been a spoiler. It's not competitive. Well, that's not the point of democracy to me, because I believe that we need to make democracy accessible to more people. And I don't look down on people who don't vote in primaries, because they are overwhelmingly younger, have less resources, their lives are more chaotic, they are moving more. You know, we don't have a national day of primary. It varies, so it's really hard to know. It is a privilege of people whose lives are stable to be able to know what's going on and be informed about primaries. And I want to make that possible for as many people as possible, but we don't live in that world right now. And I don't want to take away choices from voters in November, because that is when people know and pay attention, and I want diverse choice, because I believe that healthy democracy means having the ability to vote for someone who shares your values.
Thank you. This concludes the Measure 90 portion of today's forum. We thank each of our speakers for participating and also thank our volunteers. Please check our website, lwvpdx.org, to view all our forums on demand and for replay dates, times, and channels for local access television. Pick up the League of Women Voters Voters Guide here and at your local public library. Online, you can check vote411.org for a preview of your personal ballot. Election Day is November 4. As with all Oregon elections, you will receive a mail-in ballot. Must be mailed back early. I would recommend Halloween, to an official or delivered by hand to an official drop-off site anywhere in Oregon, no later than 8 p.m. on Tuesday. Postmarks really don't count. This is Debbie Kaye for the League of Women Voters of Portland. Thank you very much for coming. Please be an informed voter and remember that your vote counts. Thank you. Thank you very much.